and welcome to Podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. Building data integration workflows is time-consuming and tedious, requiring an unpleasant amount of boilerplate code to do it right. Rivery is a managed platform for building your ELT pipelines that offers the industry's first native integration with Python, allowing you to seamlessly load and export Pandas data frames to and from all of your databases, services, and data warehouses with a few clicks and no extra code. Rivery is hosting a live demo of their first-class Python support on February 22nd, and when you use the promo code PYTHON during registration, you will be entered to win a brand new Series 7 Apple Watch. Go to pythonpodcast.com/Rivery today to learn more and register. When you're ready to launch your next app or want to try a project you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so take a look at our friends over at Linode. With the launch of their managed Kubernetes platform, it's easy to get started with the next generation of deployment and scaling, powered by the battle-tested Linode platform, including simple pricing, node balancers, 40 gigabit networking, dedicated CPU and GPU instances, and worldwide data centers. Go to pythonpodcast.com/Linode, that's Linode, today and get a $100 credit to try out a Kubernetes cluster of your own. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. Your host, as usual, is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Eric Arellano, Stu Hood, and Andreas Stenius about the Pants build tool and all of the work that has gone into it over the past year and a half. So, Eric, can you start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Eric. I use they, them pronouns. I have been using Python for about 6 years and a maintainer of Pants for a little over 3 years, where I first started using the project as an intern at Foursquare and ended up changing my internship project about halfway through the summer to lead Pants' Python 3 migration. Fell in love with the community and have been contributing to it since, for a little bit working at Twitter and now working at a startup called Toolchain.
And Stu, how about yourself?
Sure. I was introduced to Python via the Pants project after spending a lot of time on the JVM. I've been working on Pants for something like 8 or 9 years now. We'll get more into the history, but not too deep. It's a lot of history. And I think Python has been just a huge boon for the project, so I'm really happy to talk more about how we use it.
And Andreas, how about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Andreas Stenius. I joined the Pants build community about a year ago and fell in love quite straight away with design and the community and the spirit and everything there is. So I've been working closely with the team and became a maintainer last summer and been working on the Docker integration and the Docker backend in Pants.
Eric and Stu, you already mentioned a bit about how you got introduced to Python. So Andreas, do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
Introduced to Python as a DevOps developer at Svenska Spel, where I'm currently employed. And it was 7 years ago, thereabouts. So I've been doing mainly Python development for the past 7 years.
And so in terms of the Pants project itself, Stu, as you mentioned, it has relatively long history. And for folks that want to dig into the details of that, I'll point them back at the previous interview that you and Eric were on about a year and a half ago. But for folks who haven't listened to that yet, if you want to just give kind of the Cliff's Notes version of what Pants is and some of the story behind how it came to be and how you got to where we are today.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the things about Pants' history is that many build tools, and I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean there, start as single project build tools and then evolve in the other direction. They evolve to support monorepos or to support larger projects that are made up of more units of code. Pants started in the opposite direction. It started from attempting to support monorepos as well as it possibly could, and then scaling down as much as we possibly can. So by a build system, I mean we are a tool for executing all of the steps between writing your code and taking it to production, which involves running your tests as parallel as possible, running linters, formatters, type checkers, doing code gen for you such that you don't have to commit it to your repository, making your scripts as formal and checkable as possible, running REPLs, doing packaging and publishing. So there are a lot of steps that you would otherwise have to script inconsistently and then sort of maintain scripts for. All of those steps we strive to pipeline, run in parallel, run accurately and correctly, And so we integrate with all of the tools you're used to, like pip and PyTest and Black and MyPy and Twine and Docker. But then we attempt to provide the most consistent and easy to use interface that we can atop those. In many cases, those tools are shaped similarly. So you have maybe 8 or 9 linters that people will use commonly with Python. And knowing the right arguments to invoke all of them, almost no one does. So they're going to put them in a script. We remove the need for that script. And we additionally prevent somebody having to write a script that's going to figure out how to invoke linters in parallel on only the changed files. So we're focused on improving the developer experience regardless of repo size. But as I said, our history has been in monorepos, and that's where we still shine the most.
And to your point of the scope of concerns that are encapsulated by build tools, I'm wondering if you can maybe talk through the range of considerations that Pants is trying to address and some of the pieces that you have explicitly opted to not try to include into the Pants experience and defer to other systems or other tool chains.
I can say that our bias has been toward inclusion into the core of Pants for a few reasons. And one of them is that our plugin API isn't stable yet. And so when people write plugins for Pants in the core, we gain the benefit of experience of seeing, this plugin, which does something, vastly different from what we could have expected, is in the core and gives us experience about how easy the plugin API is to use. And we can sort of notice the rough edges and help. And it gives anyone who contributes to the project the benefit of us maintaining that code. So as to the scope, we would like to be surprised. We would like somebody to come along and say, hey, we want to add a plugin for X tool that I've never heard of. That can absolutely be in scope if there are, non-private companies that want to use it, or even if there are, enough private companies that want to use it, as long as it's not completely custom internal code, we would be interested in accepting it. And I think Andreas in particular has a lot of experience recently with, understanding a use case better than we do, and then contributing something, hey, that's in scope. We just didn't know. So thank you for bringing it with his Docker work.
Yeah, we also take the approach that if you as a user experience a particular need or you're confused, for example, with a certain part of our docs, it's very likely that other people also have the same problem. And we simply don't know that they do. So we always appreciate whenever people come on our Slack, for example, and share that they're confused with a part of our docs or that they have a certain feature request, because we assume that they're speaking for dozens of other users who might not even tried Pants yet. But because of that feedback, they'll be able to have a better experience.
And to the point of having a consistent interface for all of the different stages of the software development lifecycle, there are a number of other tools that have aimed to have a similar approach, with maybe the most venerable being the Make tool, but some more recent entries being something like the Earthly project. I'm just wondering if you can share your thoughts on the considerations that go into building this common interface and the design of it, and maybe some of the ways that Pants might be compared to or against some of the tools like Make or Earthly or some of the other environments that try to give this consistent experience.
I think one thing that is definitely different from Make, and I don't have experience with Earthly, but would be interested, is that we are attempting to actually attach more semantic meaning to groups of things that you might want to do. So Pants has separate goals, capital G goal, for various tasks that you might want to execute. And we're trying to bundle all of the things that have the same semantic meaning into one command line invoke. So if you want to test, that's one goal. If you want to lint, that's a separate goal. If you want to check, that's a third goal. And lint and check are an interesting case because we've been differentiating between lightweight linters that are mostly about style and heavier weight checks like type checking, right? So MyPy and PyWrite, and even actually, ironically, PyLint are fairly heavy checks that use the transitive dependencies, all of your code, essentially. Anytime they check anything, they take a lot longer to run. And so we sort of consider them to have a different semantic meaning than just linters. Better example, though, is probably like packaging and publishing. They have a clear semantic meaning. If you were going to implement packaging and publishing in Make, for example, you'd be doing it from scratch and you'd be figuring out what should the semantics of publish and packaging be. Whereas when we model packaging and publishing, we're thinking through what that usually looks like for a user and making sure that the arguments are consistent and the behavior is consistent and performant.
Another major differentiator for Pants is that it has a really fine-grained understanding of your project's dependencies. So it understands, for example, that this file depends on that one, which depends on this other one. And with that information, you can do things like only run tests that have been impacted. So if you change like a common library, we can figure out that 10 of your tests out of 100 have been changed, and we don't need to rerun the others. That all happens automatically. Normally, to have that really fine-grained information with older build systems like Bazel, you have to have a lot of boilerplate, that you essentially duplicate your imports and have these things called build files, where you explicitly teach the tool, this depends on that. And instead, with Pants, it's a major goal of the project that it be really easy to adopt and a joy to use. So we have a thing called dependency inference, where we'll read your import statements for you and then map back those imports to the rest of your project. So you get those benefits of fine-grained metadata and fine-grained dependencies without having a bunch of boilerplate that you need to maintain.
Another aspect of having this common interface to all the different kind of broad tasks that you might do in the software development lifecycle, one of the other things that is interesting to think about as a user of Pants is how much ownership of all of that you want to push fully into Pants versus how much you might want to also execute via these other more dedicated tools. So the thing that comes to mind most notably for myself is pre-commit, where I have a number of pre-commit checks that I might want to run using their default sort of out-of-the-box supported plugins. So Flake8, MyPy, Black, all of those can run as pre-commit checks. I can also have Pants run all of those things. And so I can get some measure of consistency by ensuring that they're deferring to like the setup.config or pyproject.toml for setting up how those different executables want to run. But there's also the question of, do I want pre-commit to run all these checks independently, or do I want pre-commit to call into Pants, or do I want Pants to call into pre-commit? So just figuring out like what are the different contexts in which you want to execute which tool.
Absolutely. And I think that we're similar to pre-commit in that they are choosing a particular semantic task, which is everything that sort of like blocks committing. But by choosing that as their only goal, they are essentially limiting the scope of what you can do with pre-commit. You're probably not going to run your entire test suite with pre-commit because, that's not going to scale with your project. You don't want to wait for that, right? So they're going to sort of, by choosing that one semantic scope of things that are fast enough to run just before I commit, that's sort of one of Pants's multiple goals. So we provide a consistent interface across other tasks that you might do other than just the things that are fast enough to run before commit. So if pre-commit is adding value, like using pre-commit to call us would get you some consistency in that you can then use Pants directly or use Pants in CI. I think having the whole suite of goals is kind of an interesting thing because in common usage, you're going to iterate on code by sort of like running your tests or linting or type checking. And you may not want to run all of those. You're going to cherry pick which of the things are relevant at a particular point in time. You know that you haven't made enough. You've only changed a comment. You're not going to bother running all of the tests. Maybe you're just going to run formatting because doc formatter might complain about that otherwise. But the developer is usually picking and choosing how much they need to do at any given point in time. And we're just providing a consistent interface for that.
Yeah, and that being said, another major focus we've really focused on in the past year is allowing you to incrementally adopt Pants. That we know a lot of organizations already have really big repos and might have workflows and tools that are working well for them. And we want it to be easy that you can incrementally add Pants, that you might start with only using it for your formatters and linters, for example, or only using it for test. So there have been a lot of features where we can complement the workflow that you already have. For example, one of our users is still sticking with their current test runner while they migrate, but they're using Pants's dependency information that I was talking about earlier to grab the metadata about what tests should we run. So they run Pants for the query and then pipe it into their original test workflow.
At work, I've used pre-commit to invoke Pants to get a consistent output. Like there shouldn't be a difference if I run the pre-commit hook or if I run Pants directly. It should say the same about the current state of my code. So if pre-commit ran the same tool but potentially with some different configuration, that would possibly not be the case. And it has worked out really well, I think so.
And in terms of the Pants project itself, as I mentioned at the beginning, we did an episode about the Pants project about a year and a half ago. And since that time, it seems like there's been a very rapid uptake in the pace of development and the size of the community and the number of capabilities that have been built into it. I'm wondering if you can give some of the notable changes in the project and its ecosystem and community that have taken place over that time.
I would say that the largest change in the last year has been that we've spent a lot of time going more polyglot, adding some more languages. In particular, we've added support for Go, Scala, and Java. And if you count our Docker integration, which is a fantastic job with Docker files, are a language in and of themselves, I suppose. We've learned a huge amount and improved the plugin API to support those languages better. And users have sort of been satisfied that they've been able to keep this consistent interface across multiple languages within their repository, which is sort of one of the promises that we are attempting to fulfill. We also have spent more time improving the lock file story. I think in our last conversation, one of the gray areas was the question of having incompatible projects within a monorepo, those with sort of overlapping requirements where one library requires one version and one library requires another. Having those overlapping requirements without having a global lock file is interesting because how single project polyrepo tools like Poetry and Tox and piplock would do, or pipfreeze would do it, is they'd have a lock file per project or unit of code. And we think that we found a really great design that sort of threads the needle between one lock file for your entire repository or one lock file and potentially inconsistent, incompatible dependencies between all of your units of code. And we're hoping to ship that in the next few weeks. We can definitely talk more about that.
Yeah, beyond code changes, you're right that the community has grown a lot the past year. We've had a lot of new users and organizations joining our Slack every day. One of the things I've been most excited about is honing in on what being a part of our community means. Originally, we used to primarily think of contributions in terms of code. And this past year, we restructured everything that we no longer call them our maintainers committers, but we now call them maintainers. And we recognize that contributions take a ton of different forms, including docs. But one of the big things we've focused on is how useful it is to get feedback from where things are confusing in future requests. Even if you never write a piece of code or don't change docs, simply letting us know how you're using Pants is extremely helpful to our project so that we can focus on making the tool more useful for everyday users.
Going back to the question of the scope of the project and figuring out what you want to build, obviously, if somebody comes to you from the community with a contribution, there's not as much scoping to do there, but there is also the question of, does this belong in core or as a plugin? And I'm just wondering if you can talk through some of the conversations that you have as the core maintainer team and some of the ways that you engage with the community to figure out what is the overall scope of what belongs in core versus what belongs as a plugin, and how to prioritize the baseline capabilities that the Pants tool should provide out of the box and the interfaces that it can expose to give control to end users to be able to customize to suit their needs.
I think one useful recent example was that the Autoflake plugin starts to cross the line between a auto formatter and a sort of a fixer, where it does potentially change the semantic meaning of your code by deleting import statements. And it's incredibly useful. that was a contribution from the community. And I think we have to continue to bias toward inclusion in all cases because they force us to think about where our semantic boundaries between these goals are wrong. I think the hit rate of, hey, somebody considering whether something should go upstream or not is pretty high. And there's survivorship bias, of course, because there are probably a lot of things that people keep private and don't tell us about. But when people, have even an inkling that something might be useful to the wider project, our answer is yes, that is useful. And something like, 95 or 98% of use cases that people have so far fit into, the goal, the buckets that we've designed, the goals. And I think that's been reassuring. Would continue to like to be surprised. If somebody really wants to lean in on making deployment something that we should be orchestrating with Pants, like that's something we could definitely discuss. It's not something we have a goal for yet. Right now, we will go as far as packaging and publishing, but we're not necessarily going to orchestrate, the restarting of your cluster, for example. People might have custom goals for that. It's something that we'd be willing to discuss and include. But it's just always a learning experience to have potential contributions. And so that's where we're at. Bring your ideas, and we're going to bias toward bringing them on board.
To your point of making it easier to incrementally adopt Pants and easier to get started, I know that the Tailor capability hadn't quite made it into the core or was just very recently added to the core the last time we spoke. And I know that has been going through some evolution, and I've used it myself a few times. So I'm just wondering if you can talk to some of the ergonomic improvements that you've added to make it easier to manage the adoption and getting started and kind of reduce the level of effort that's required to be able to try out Pants and understand if it's right for your organization.
Yeah, we have a really strong belief in the project that the tool should adapt to you rather than you having to adapt to the tool. So we set up Pants intentionally that we can handle multiple different code structures. Like we were talking about, it's possible and hopefully easy to be able to integrate Pants incrementally in addition to your current workflow. So we made a couple changes to make the onboarding process even faster. One of them that you're talking about with Tailor is that we have these build files, which are usually only 1 to 2 lines that give us metadata about your code. So you can do things like setting a timeout on certain tests. Now we'll scan your repository and then generate those 1 to 2 line files for you. And then with that, we also are inferring your dependencies, like we talked about. Another really important part of ergonomics that we think about is the difference between power users and everyday users. When you use Pants, that's something that usually every engineer at your organization will use. And we hear a lot from power users who are the people on our Slack or who are opening GitHub issues. But we try to think a lot about that everyday user who might not be as active, but is still using Pants. And put a lot of focus on optimizing our experience for them, which includes things like really intense focus on error messages that we assume that most everyday users don't very thoroughly read our docs. And rather than expecting users to change and adapt to us, we try to adapt to the user. So within the past year, we've audited a lot of our error messages and set them up, rewritten them, and improved them so that even if you didn't read our docs, you can intuit what's going on and figure it out.
In terms of the challenges that teams run into as they're starting to work through the adoption of Pants, and maybe they're starting to move into a monorepo structure for their code for the first time, what are some of the complexities that they run into as they're starting to figure out how to architect the repository layout, how to architect the workflow of their Pants configurations, figuring out what are the appropriate places to add the Python case, what are the appropriate places to add the Python distribution configurations versus just letting it be a Python source target, the types of custom plugins that they might want to build to simplify their workflows to say, this is my version schema to be able to say across the board, whenever I run Pants, it will generate the right version for setup.py, just any of those kinds of considerations as they're starting to scale adoption.
I think at a fundamental level, monorepos are about a few things, but the primary thing that they're about is sort of a desire for consistency and scalability. So it really matters, and not just across the projects that you have, but maybe also across multiple languages if you do have multiple languages in a repository. And so the challenges adopting Pants and adopting a monorepo depend a lot on whether you're sort of like converting from a polyrepo, having lots of projects in different repositories, or converting from a monorepo using a different tool to using Pants. And so those two cases are pretty different, the challenges you encounter. The thing when converting from polyrepo to monorepo is you are probably already inconsistent unless you've done a huge amount of work to reuse the boilerplate. For example, if you've used a template generator, you've generated the code in one place, but then you've committed it, and so it can diverge because people are going to edit, all that boilerplate, and they're going to end up with inconsistent requirements and scripts and all this. So going from polyrepo to monorepo, it really depends how quickly you're trying to apply the consistency or get the consistency. And so while adopting Pants, like part of why I think our resolve strategy that I mentioned earlier, the idea of not necessarily having a single global resolve for your repository and not necessarily having a resolve per project, is it's definitely a spectrum between long-time monorepo, incredible consistency of all the projects, and you're using a single version of almost everything, versus just onboarding to that experience. And it's not necessarily the case that a monorepo that is 100% consistent and doesn't allow the use of multiple versions, like some tools sort of make difficult, is better. It's not always the case that stricter is better. It's a spectrum, and having the flexibility to have inconsistency is an important thing. So depending on which end of the spectrum you're migrating from, for people migrating from a monorepo with a different tool, we might be making things more flexible and easier. And going from a polyrepo, we might be applying the consistency that you've been lacking by having, a bunch of copy-pasted code in a bunch of repos. So hopefully this resolve strategy, we're very optimistic the next few weeks, about a month, that we'll have more to share on that. The other thing is, anytime somebody comes to us, they have huge test suites. And I think our goal is that Pants makes CI a one-liner, sort of regardless of your repository size. We have a long way to achieve that, but CI being a one-liner regardless of repository size requires a lot of things. It requires caching. If your repository is huge, it might require remote execution, which we also support. If you want to run a variety of different goals and maybe even package and publish, you'd like to be able to include all of those on one line. If you include all those as your invoke of Pants, you would want it all to run concurrently. So we think there's an opportunity to remove a huge amount of sort of the boilerplate of CI config and the lock-in that you have at various CI providers of huge amounts of YAML and probably YAML generators, YAML generator generators, to essentially make the CI experience very, very similar to what you run on the command line, but just for a smaller scope, right? I'm testing just this one file as opposed to the entire repository, but the command is similar. And the scalability means you don't need an entire separate framework for CI versus local. So for teams onboarding to monorepos, that's sort of this promise that we'd like to achieve. And the challenge is always that the larger the project, the more work it is to achieve that goal. So we'll continue working on that, and we're happy to help teams sort of like onboard to this monorepo experience.
And to that point of consistency and onboarding, and particularly as you're expanding into supporting multiple different language runtimes, one of the complexities that comes about there is being able to manage the execution environment, which a lot of developer teams these days are leaning on Docker for that. And I know that, Andreas, you recently added support for Docker natively into the Pants build toolchain. So I'm wondering if you can talk to how that manifests and what that workflow looks like for people who are using Pants and want to be able to use Docker to manage the actual execution context without having to do a bunch of setup on developer machines or having to replicate that in their CI ecosystem.
One of my pain points I was looking for to solve when I discovered Pants was to be able to deprecate and get away from our custom build tools we have built around how to build and manage our Docker images. So we have this kind of custom Docker build tool that we call Welder. That's basically a version of a multi-stage Docker file. Before Docker had support for multi-stage. So what it does is set up all the different arguments to run Docker, to build and run images in sequence, various pipelines, and tagging images right and left. So maintaining those build pipelines using that tool was becoming increasingly difficult. Entered Pants and fell in love with the engine and the rule system and thought that, hey, it shouldn't be too difficult to implement our Docker infrastructure needs into Pants. And reading more about it, I noticed that there was a demand or other that had asked for the feature to support Docker in Pants. So when I raised my hand last summer and said, I would be interested in implementing Docker support for Pants. So I got to go ahead for that. So the experience was a real delight, implementing it incrementally with basic support for just invoking a simple Docker build command, integrating with Tailor to generate the build file necessary for adding the Docker image target that you have. So what Pants needs to know in order for you to use Docker is just point at the Docker file and whatever dependencies that you want to have included in your build context for Docker. If you use the PEX file, it's a Python executable that you can package with Pants. You can even infer the dependency on that from your Docker file. From that, we have built on top of that to manage publish images to registries, and also you can chain your Docker images. If you have a common base image, you build that first to then go on and build your other images that depend on that base image.
And thanks to the infrastructure that we already have, all of that works with change detection. So if a file has been edited, the Docker images, perhaps a whole chain of them that depend on that file, will show up in change detection. You can determine which Docker images need to be republished. And I think from an architectural changes perspective, this gets to my point about CI and making that essentially a one-liner. I think to achieve that, you would need to actually rebuild the relevant images. You might, if you had any sort of native code going into those Docker images, want to execute the compilation of the relevant wheels either inside the Docker image or outside of them, but in parallel, right? For as many Docker images as you have, you might want that to execute on a remote machine if it can. And so the Docker support is fantastic. One of the frontiers that we'd like to continue to explore with it is continuing to remove the steps sort of before and after Pants in CI, which might include, I've got a custom wheel that I need to build in order to put it in the Docker container, or I'm going to, invoke Docker to do something before the build. If we continue to expand our support for essentially cross-building in Docker, your execution platform might be macOS, it might be Linux, but you essentially cross-build into Docker from your local platform. That's sort of, a local developer running on Windows or macOS, transparently using Docker only when they need to for the cross-building portion is something that we'd like to continue to push in the next year. There's improvements planned in that area. Right now, cross-platform Docker builds are possible as long as they're in native code. So we'd like to improve that.
In terms of the support for multiple language runtimes, that's also an interesting challenge beyond just managing the execution context, as far as this goal of consistency and ease of adoption for end users of the Pants build tool. And given that Pants itself is written largely in Python with a Rust core for the execution engine, I'm wondering how you've approached the sort of design of the experience for these additional language runtimes so that it feels idiomatic and approachable for people who are maybe not Python native or maybe don't even use Python in the repository at all?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we support now Go, Java, Scala. We've supported Python for past 10 years. And one of the really interesting ones is shell support. And with each of those languages, we spend a lot of time first thinking about what are the unique strengths of Pants in this ecosystem and what does this ecosystem already do well. We very much view the role of Pants as complementary. So for example, with shell, Pants hooks up with the amazing shell check linter and the SH formatter, which is kind of like Black. It will make your scripts pretty automatically. And then a unit test framework called SH Unit 2. And we decided to focus on those three things with shell rather than trying to hook up with things like running or packaging, because shell already has really good, simple support for things like executing your script. And we didn't think that Pants would add that much value to it. Whereas we could add a lot of value that will install those tools like shell check for you, making sure that everyone, whether you're in CI or your different developers, that they're all using the exact same version, then run it with this consistent interface. We'll run that all in parallel so that you can run shell check at the same time as Flake 8 and Black and ISort and so on. Same with Go. Go already has really strong tooling. So we actually leverage a lot of the underlying Go tooling and make it better with things like this consistent interface and benefits like caching.
Yeah, and I would also say that the check goal that I referenced earlier is an interesting example of making a consistent experience across multiple language ecosystems. MyPy had actually been in a goal called type check until recently, and we deprecated that goal and renamed it to check because there is a shared semantic meaning across all of Python, Go, and JVM languages like Java and Scala, which is that you want to do as much as possible to ensure that your code is correct. And that might be type checking, but it might just be compilation. And so for Go, Java, and Scala, it is compilation. The check goal runs compilation. And it does so in a similar amount of time, sort of in relative terms to MyPy, type checking your code. MyPy is definitely a little bit faster, but needing your transitive dependencies in this goal is sort of the common thread. So the check goal is an example of, finding the shared semantic meaning across languages. It's definitely not linting. It's doing something more heavyweight. You definitely want to run it before you submit your code. You may not necessarily want to iterate on it for absolutely every edit. Maybe you do. So I think that's an example of this consistency that we're trying to apply.
To that point of consistency across these different language environments, how would you characterize the overall, I don't know if you'd call it feature coverage or coverage of specific targets or goals that are supported across these environments, and any kind of foundational changes that were necessary in Pants itself to be able to support adding these different runtime environments?
Go was interesting in that users have very different expectations of what they are going to build. It's directory-centric, which isn't really super common. Python's very file-centric, and Java and Scala are as well. So as we added these languages, we had some surprises, but at the same time, I think the JVM languages were pleasantly straightforward to add. So I think the foundation that we have has proved itself to be really useful. At the same time, we have definitely noticed now with half a dozen languages that there's some boilerplate for plugin authors that we'd like to remove. So we will definitely be doing a little bit more work as Go and Java and Scala are stabilized themselves to remove that boilerplate internally so that, the next dozen languages are added. There's less for rule authors to either trip on or have to sort of mindlessly copy. I would say that the other thing that we've definitely seen as we've added these other languages is that dependency inference has been a success in all of them. It's useful sort of regardless of how structured your import statements are or aren't. Java and Scala have gained sort of significant benefit in that you can compile at a very fine-grained level. In Go, it's just an expectation that you don't have to, write a bunch of metadata about your build in order for things to compile, because the Go tooling uses your import statements sort of the same way dependency inference does. Likewise, the Python ecosystem, people don't want, to repeat themselves, and we are trying to avoid that. So I think dependency inference scaling to all these languages has been really important as well. I think As we continue to expand language support, I think it'll be interesting to lean in further on the assumption that there is dependency inference and see what we can do to further lower either the boilerplate for users when they're creating a repository or for plugin authors. What would it look like for dependency inference not to be optional? How much can we remove in that case? It's on by default, to be clear.
And as far as the growth of the community and overall adoption of the project, I'm curious what your strategy is for being able to scale the community and scale the interaction and engagement patterns that have helped you go from small scale to where you are now, and how you're thinking about the continued growth of the ecosystem now that you seem to be kind of at a tipping point where you're adding these additional language environments. You're trying to expand beyond your initial base of enthusiastic and power users into people who are finding it and maybe just want to have something that runs and they don't necessarily care about being as enthusiastically engaged, or just some of that overall community growth aspect of the project.
My first interaction with the community when I approached Pants was to ask about a feature that I thought was missing. And the response I got really quickly from Eric was that, sure, why don't you put up a PR for it? And so I was rather delighted on the welcoming spirit. The welcoming spirit was really encouraging for me to contribute more and to get to know Pants better and learn more about it. And I think I see that in other members of the community too, that come in and they're enthusiastic about what they see, and they have all these ideas, how those ideas are welcomed and how they are received, that encourages people to stay and continue to invest and go deeper into the community and becoming contributors or maintainers in the long run.
Yeah, I think as a maintainer, it's always a question, how much time do we spend directly interacting with the community and, for example, mentoring possible new contributors? One thing that really helps frame our perspective here is the idea of the curse of knowledge, which in some Buddhist circles is called beginner's mind. That curse of knowledge is once you learn something, it's really hard to go back to where you didn't know that thing before. So once you're a Pants power user, it's hard to remember what it was first like when you were using it and take that perspective, no matter how much you try. And like we were talking about earlier, we think a lot about power users versus those everyday users or people who are just using this to get something done. We want it to be a great experience for everyday users. So we very intentionally seek that feedback from beginners and think that beginners often have a perspective that makes the entire project a lot better. We're always eager to actively support people who are trying out Pants for the first time, who want to do a new contribution. We often pair program with them, for example. And beyond helping them to have a good experience, it's also helping the project that we get to see things from their perspective.
Yeah, and it's also the case that a huge number of people who use Pants will never contribute to it. We love any sort of contribution, and I guess that depends on the definition of the word contribute. A lot of people's contribution might also just be answering questions. So in terms of scaling a project, building a community that's welcoming and that sort of echoes and people pass on the assistance that they received, it goes a long way. Identifying which people to encourage contributions from or patches, you always ask, but you're also willing to dive in and do it yourself. So we love all contributions, but if you can't, we're always willing to help.
Another aspect of the community growth and community engagement and the ease of adoption is having useful examples that you can point to of this is how you use Pants, or here's a list of plugins that you can use in your project that are generally available. And I'm curious what you're thinking is as far as how to encourage that level of contribution and adoption and being able to build up that library of examples that people can learn from so that you don't have to necessarily retread the same ground with everybody. You can say, if you're coming from this language ecosystem, here is kind of the reference implementation of how you can get up and running. Here are a set of useful plugins and things like that. And also just because of the fact that a lot of the plugin development happens inside the monorepo, ways to think about architecting that experience so that it is more conducive to contributing those plugins either back upstream to Pants or into a repository or even just like an awesome list on GitHub or something like that.
Yeah, I can say that we love when people contribute examples because it's a demonstration of how much boilerplate we still have. It also is sort of a way for us to learn how people learned about the project, right? If they didn't discover some feature and we can help improve their example, that's a lesson that we can take back to improve our documentation so that when they're getting started, they don't need to, bend over backwards. And I think the other thing about example code is that it's always a good thing to look at in terms of how much boilerplate you have, right? If our examples all consisted of a single line, like I was promising with CI, then we would know that we had no more boilerplate to remove, right? What's the example? Well, I run this one line and you run that one line. Oh, how can we reduce that further? So the size of any given example, you want to push that down. You want to play a game of golf in terms of the total number of lines required to accomplish some goal. So we love seeing contributed examples. Also, to be clear, our goal is absolutely to stabilize the plugin API and not require that people write things in core. I really hope that that is going to be the when we blossom in terms of lists of third-party plugins existing, right? Right now, we absolutely love a third-party plugin. It's going to be easier in many cases for both the contributor and any consumers of the plugin if it lives in core, because we can essentially maintain it for you. We can continue to expand the API. Third-party plugins are absolutely something that we want to, further encourage. We promise that we're going to make that easier in the future.
As you have been growing and scaling the community and the project itself and growing the number of use cases that it supports, what are some of the most interesting or innovative or unexpected ways that you've seen it applied?
I tend to push the boundaries of what you're meant to do with a piece of software or technology or anything really. One of the first things my mind started doing when I discovered Pants was, where else can I use this? So I have a kind of proof of concept project where I try to leverage the rule engine of Pants for any kind of Python application. So instead of writing kind of plugins and build files and running the regular Pants command line to get into the engine, you can instead use the Pants engine as a library that you load from your Python code and set up the engine and then just start writing rules right off the bat. It was surprisingly easy to get working actually. So there's a underpants kind of library that does that.
Oh, Pants, the name that keeps on giving. I was really appreciative recently. We had somebody contribute a PyOxidizer plugin, and it was mind-bending because when I first considered integrating PyOxidizer, because PyOxidizer is written in Rust and Pants is as well, I initially went down the path of attempting to integrate directly with the Rust code, but a contributor came along and essentially dropped it in atop our Python distribution support. So PyOxidizer is going to be supported relatively soon in an experimental fashion. Probably the 2.10 release will have some experimental support. And I think that was innovative and unexpected in how simple it ended up being when I ignored the fact that there was Rust involved in both of these projects and they can integrate across the distribution boundary, the Python distribution boundary. So I think that's both innovative and exciting, is an alternative to Docker for folks who know their deployment environment really, really well.
And in your experience of being contributors and maintainers to the Pants project, and I'm sure consumers of it as well, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned in the process?
For me, it's been how awesome of a combination Rust and Python is when used together. For any Spanish speakers, I actually have a PyCon talk last year about when to use Rust native extensions. So about 70% of Pant is written in Python 3, and about 30% our core engine is written in Rust, which is the engine that schedules everything, like how to sequence which task and handles things like caching. Rust is pretty new for me. I've only learned it in the past year. There's this amazing library called Pyo3 that makes it surprisingly easy to integrate Rust and Python, that we have both Rust code we wrote in Python and the other way around.
Yeah, and I would say that something that's not necessarily new and probably a classic issue is just that async code, where you're no longer using operating system thread stacks, whether it be in Python or on the JVM or in Rust, is kind of a pain to observe and to apply metrics to and to get stack traces from. Luckily, we have sort of a growing body of infrastructure to make all of that possible, but it does in some cases end up coming down to creating your own tools for observability and performance work, which is definitely a focus for us. Go, for example, it can't use the operating system level stack traces. You need custom tooling for that. So async observability, async has all the benefits, but a few downsides as well.
And so for folks who are interested in being able to have consistency of their experience across the software development lifecycle, what are the cases where Pants is the wrong choice and they're better off using either discrete tooling or some homegrown solution or something built into their CI framework, et cetera?
Sure. So the most obvious answer is that there's still some languages and ecosystems that we don't have first-class support yet for. A big one is JavaScript, that there are some ways to get JavaScript working with Pants, but in general, we find that most users for now are still managing JavaScript using tools like Yarn and NPM and integrate with Python. That's one of the biggest things that this next year, we just are wrapping up a community survey that we hear from our community that we'd love to add proper first-class support for. So even if Pants doesn't yet support your language, the plugin API means that we can add support and the community is really responsive. But that's an obvious case where you might need to either use multiple different workflows and tools.
And the amount of boilerplate required to get a project going is still a thing that can mean that Pants is not absolutely perfect for your tiny, tiny, tiny project, right? The bar on whether Pants becomes useful continues to move, and hopefully we continue to move it in the direction of, sure, as soon as you hit 200 lines, Pants is worth adding to your project, right? We'd like that bar to be ever lower. And I think we've done a reasonably good job, but there's always more to do.
You've mentioned a number of things that you have planned for the near to medium term future of the Pants project. And so rather than digging more into that, I guess I'd be interested to explore some of the sustainability of the project and how you're able to spend so much of your time and focus on continuing to scale it and grow it and make it available for end users.
Well, I can say that the Pants community has ever more open source maintainers from more diverse backgrounds. That's a great thing. We're super happy to have Andreas. We have another maintainer that came on board recently from another organization. And that's always helpful. Like, you want your open source project to have a really diverse community, and that is our goal. At the same time, we also have corporate backing, and that is a useful thing, right? People need support in their project when they have, either enterprise use cases or other things. So I think that we are continuing to strive for a good balance of open source governance and corporate support when you need it.
From my perspective, it is either we develop the tooling ourselves in-house with a custom tool chain and everything, and with all the maintenance that comes with it, or we can get involved with an open source one where we have a whole community that all pitch in and help develop it. We can develop the features that we think make sense for us and get the benefit of all the additional features we didn't even think of from everyone else. Together we maintain it and bring it forward. So it's a win-win situation to be part of.
Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch and follow along with each of you, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And so with that, I'll move us into the picks. And this week I'm going to choose a new show I started watching recently called Last Kingdom on Netflix. It's just a very engaging and well-written and well-executed historical drama fiction about the kind of early Middle Ages or Dark Ages in England, and focused on the invasion of the Danes and their conquest of England and surrounding regions, and just really well done show. So definitely recommend that for folks who are looking for something to watch. And so with that, I'll pass it to you, Eric. What do you have for a pick this week?
Sure. My pick is a new show on Netflix from Jonathan Van Ness, who's one of the hosts on Queer Eye. And Jonathan has a new show called Getting Curious. One of the episodes that came out last week is a 30-minute segment on gender non-binary people, which, like I imagine most listeners grew up not really realizing that non-binary people exist and how much gender controls things like how we dress and how we talk and what sports you can play and so on. So I thought it was a really engaging and informative 30-minute episode that can possibly help you better get to know your coworkers or family members or even open source maintainer.
And Stu, how about yourself?
I've really enjoyed the Checks and Balance podcast, which is sort of economist American podcast. They really introduce history in a useful way. And so it helps to put, the story of the day in context. So every episode, is a good lesson, not just about the present, but also the past. So.
And Andreas, how about you? What's your pick for this week?
My pick would be the book by Andy and Dave, The Pragmatic Programmer. I've read it many years ago when I was starting out as a software developer. It has influenced me deeply from then on, so I can heartily recommend it. Published the 20th anniversary edition a few years ago.
It's a classic, and not only has it supported my programming career, it's also literally supporting my laptop right now by raising it a few inches off the table. So, great book. I have it memorized, so I don't need to crack it very often.
Another related one that's really good is The Effective Engineer.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for taking the time today to join me and share the work that you've been doing on Pants. It's a tool that I've been enjoying using and has helped a lot with some of the projects that I'm building at work. So thank you all for the time and energy you put into that, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Tobias. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, the Data Engineering Podcast, at dataengineeringpodcast.com for the latest on modern data management. And visit the site at pythonpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts@podcastinit.com with your story. To help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.